Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me here today for Precision Digital's presentation of our new Modbus client, aka master, features available in the enhanced Modbus feature package for the Consolidator Plus. Today we're going to take a look at what you can do with those client features. We're also going to take a look at the other features you get in the new enhanced features package, like our snooper and spoofer modes. Before I get started here today, there's a couple of bookkeeping items that I just like to cover at the start of every webinar. First of all, you will have noticed that you are all in listen-only mode. In other words, you can't talk into the webinar. There are simply too many people here for us to have that many open phone lines. And so if you have a question, which I encourage you to ask, I just ask that you type it into the chat box that appears in the lower left-hand corner of your screen if you're on a computer. I'll pause during the webinar, and once at the end, to address any questions you may have. And if we don't get to your question, we will make sure that somebody from Precision Digital follows up with you on it. Second, I'll address the most common questions I get right now, which are, can I get a copy of these slides sent to me? And was there a recording of the webinar made? And the answer to both of those is yes. We are recording today's webinar, and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides emailed out to you probably by mid next week. And anyone who registered for the webinar will get that. And if you want to get it and share it with your colleagues, I certainly would appreciate that. Lastly, a personal request here. Some of you, when you leave the webinar today, will get a survey that comes up. If you could go ahead and fill that out and let us know how we did and what you might like to see from future Precision Digital webinars, I would really appreciate that. That's the kind of input we need to make sure that we keep improving these presentations and making sure that we keep offering you the kinds of topics you want to see. So with that, let me go ahead and get started today by introducing myself. My name is Joe Ryan. I'm the VP of Sales and Marketing at Precision Digital. I've been in the process signal business for about 15 years now, doing design of products, but also supporting them, manufacturing them, marketing them, et cetera, et cetera. I am an electrical engineer by classical training, and so I'm pretty familiar with how process signals and Modbus signals in our industry work. So hopefully I can answer whatever questions you may have here today. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about yourself. Let's start off with, what is your industry? Are you an industrial distributor of Precision Digitals, or are you an end user perhaps? And if you go ahead and click Other here, do me the favor of typing in what that other is into your chat box. I want to make sure that we're being pretty inclusive here with what we have available for selections, but every once in a while I have to add one because we find that people show up from an industry I don't have listed. And it looks like the majority of you out there today are distributors. We do have some end users, however, and so while I may include a couple of comments for the distributors, certainly everybody will get a benefit here today. Specifically for the distributors, we'll talk a little bit about the demo unit at the end. And those of you who clicked Other, please do me a favor, let me know what that other is. And lastly, before we get started, how familiar are you with the Consolidator Plus? Are you already an expert on the product? Perhaps you've sold it or used it. Are you vaguely familiar with it? You've had a chance to look at our demos perhaps, or read about it online. Maybe you just heard about it. That's all you know. You just know very little about it other than it is a thing. Or perhaps somehow you're here and you're wondering, hey, what is a Consolidator Plus? I'd like to know. And it looks like here the vast majority of you are somewhat familiar with it. You either know very little about it, but you've heard of it, or you're familiar with it, but we don't have any experts, and we even have a few people who this is their first introduction to the Consolidator Plus. And so we'll make sure that we cover a little bit about what the Consolidator is here at the beginning for you. So what are the agendas and takeaways from today's meeting? Well, we're going to learn the basics of the Consolidator Plus multivariable controller. Literally just a one-side overview of what this thing is, so we're all on the same page and we know what we're talking about. Then we're going to review the Modbus capabilities that come along with the new Modbus Enhanced Features package. At the same time, we're going to see how to program those features. One of the best elements of these new features is that they are very easy to program. And one theme you're going to hear a lot from me today is that this is a great product for people who really want to take advantage of their Modbus transmitters and flow meters, but don't know that much about Modbus. And you'll see that there's reasons why I say that, because with no programming and just a little bit of menu setup, you can really get access to all kinds of powerful features that those transmitters have. And then we're going to see a live demonstration of the PDD 9000. That's the demo of the Consolidator Plus that I've got sitting here on my desk. And we'll look at the screens a little bit just so you can see what it looks like on an actual product. So let's start with answering the question, what is a Consolidator Plus? So a Consolidator Plus, as you can tell by the name brand here on the front of the panel, is a product by Precision Digital that's a multivariable controller for process, display, alarm, and control applications. In other words, we accept 4 to 20 milliamp inputs, flow meter pulse inputs, digital inputs, or Modbus inputs being sent to the Consolidator Plus by a master or a client. And then it displays it for the operator. So here you see a sample screen. You can have 8 process variables per screen. This one happens to have 4. In this case, it's got 4 tank levels, water and 2 water tanks and 2 oil tanks. And it displays them on a full color display in a way that's very easy for operators to read and interact with. That's a large 5.7-inch color display on here. So even with 8 variables in that window, you can certainly see everything that's going on. You can get multiple relays in this. Potentially, if you didn't have any process inputs and all, for example, it was doing is reading Modbus values, I believe you could get yourself, pardon me for a moment here, I think you can do 30 relays, for example, on this. And those relays have user-definable actions. So we just say relays kind of as a generic term because they could be high alarms, low alarms, pump alternation, pump control. You can be using for all sorts of things, sampling relays. You can also get 4 to 20 milliamp outputs if you want to isolate those from your 4 to 20 milliamp inputs, or you want to use it as a pulse to 4 to 20 milliamp converter. We've got digital outputs to send signals simply to your PLCs. You can pull information out of it with Modbus RTU, and it is Precision Digital's first product with Modbus TCP/IP, so you can pull data out of it via Ethernet. We've got 32 timers in there that control all kinds of processes and events, and probably most importantly here, free Consolidator Plus configuration software. So though you can program this with the front panel push buttons, you don't have to, and I would actually encourage you not to. I find the software to be the easiest way to program this, and it's exceptionally helpful when you're trying to name things like your screens, where you say tank level, tanks 1 through 4. That's a lot easier to type than it is to program with these 5 rubberized push buttons on the front. So it lets you give every channel a name, units a name, screen a name, and that's just easier to do when you're using the software. So that's our brief overview of the Consolidator Plus. I'm happy to go over that with anybody who wants to learn more. If you want to learn more about the Consolidator Plus in general, please feel free to just ask later in this webinar or respond in the survey that you want us to contact you. Now let's talk about what we call our enhanced Modbus feature package. And what this is really a set of features that give you client or master mode capabilities. For those of you who are wondering what I'm talking about there when I say client, the master mode units, or the masters on the Consolidator network, are now called clients, and the slaves are now called servers. And that's a change that was made to the Modbus standard. So you will see that more and more on modern Modbus products, that they're replacing master and slave with client and server. And though it may not be fully intuitive, the master version is actually the client, whereas the server version is the slave. In addition to getting master mode capabilities, you get the snooper mode, which is really a packet sniffer, and you get our new spoofer mode as well. And that's used to assign multiple addresses to the Consolidator Plus and customize the data it responds with when it gets requests for specific registers. And we're going to take a look at all 3 of these in a little bit of detail, so if you don't fully get it yet, that's perfectly fine. I'm just introducing you to the terminology here. So you might be able to give me a little bit of an idea of how much you're familiar with Modbus, just to help me in explaining these. It'd be good to know what the audience's experience is with Modbus. And so I'll give you a second just to give me some sense there of how experienced you are with it. And it looks like, not surprisingly, the majority of you know enough to get the job done. There are a few experts out there, a few aspiring experts, Some people are wondering where you catch that modern bus, and to those folks, we can certainly talk more about Modbus. We have a whole series of fundamentals of 4-20 and pulses and Modbus available on predig.com. So if you see what we're talking about here today and it seems more interesting and you want to contact us for more info, please feel free to do so. But generally when I ask this question, enough to get the job done really is the #1 response. So I'm not surprised to see it here. So I'll use the appropriate Modbus terms, but I'll try to keep it somewhat light. So let's first talk about Modbus Client Master Scanner Mode. So this is one of those 3 capabilities you get. You get that client mode for Modbus. Just to be clear, the standard Consolidator Plus is a Modbus server or slave device, meaning it will respond to Modbus requests from a master. So if, for example, you had a PLC in the control room and you wanted to pull out some data from a Consolidator Plus, you can do that on the standard Consolidator. The Enhanced Features package, when you get that, that's how you unlock these 3 additional features. So we won't be talking too much about it as a slave device today, but we will be talking about these new features that you get with the Enhanced package, like Client or Master Server Mode. So the advantage of the client mode is that the Consolidator Plus becomes the master on the 485 bus. And by the way, I want to mention right up front, these 3 modes are only for the RS-485 connection. Modbus TCP/IP is only for Modbus slave connections. So we can be a Modbus slave if you're going to connect to it over Ethernet. But if you're using RS-485, that's where you get access to all these other features when you get that Enhanced Features package. And so the advantage of being the client or the master on the Modbus network is that we can connect up directly to Modbus devices and pull information out of those. So for example, here we've got tanks 1, 2, 3, and 4. And attached to those tanks, we have Modbus multivariable level transmitters. This is obviously just an example. These could be flow meters you wanted to pull rates and total out of. They could be any other kind of Modbus device. But a nice simple example is to use Modbus multivariable level transmitters. I like that one because it really shows the advantage Modbus brings. This level transmitter is actually measuring the top level, the interface level of the oil and water here, and it's getting an average temperature across the probe. Normally, that would require 3 4-20 milliamp outputs, and my transmitter's only got 1. So great, I've got this Modbus device. I can get all this neat data out of it. But if all I'm using is the 4-20 output, I can only get 1 of those variables sent over, and the rest are kind of a waste. So instead, I'm going to use the master mode and connect up to my server or my slave transmitters. And I gang all those up on the Modbus RS-485 bus. And now the consolidator sends the request saying, hey, transmitter 1, send me back the top level information. Hey, transmitter 1, send me back that interface level. Hey, transmitter 1, send me back the temperature information. And it just pulls that out of each one of these transmitters. And as those are slave devices, they respond. Then we'll display that information just like we would if those were actually 12 4-20 milliamp signals coming from all these things. And from there, you want to have relay outputs. You want to have 4-20 outputs. It's programmed just like those were 4-20 milliamp inputs. So because I ran 3 wires to these 4 transmitters, I can now get 12 variables out of those. And they have all the benefits of serial communication. They are always 100% accurate. I don't really have to worry about noise on the line. It's very easy and low cost to run those wires. And thanks to the Consolidator Plus's method of being set up, which we'll see in a second, it's pretty easy to do that. So what do I need to program in order to do that? Well, the Consolidator Plus basically has 1 screen for each one of those inputs I'm bringing in via Modbus. And you'll see that I'm at MB-1, so this is Modbus input 1. And I give it a name, which we're just going to keep simple and say I'm going to name that input Modbus input 1. We set it to client mode because we're going to be the master doing the polling. Then I give it the server ID. In other words, what number is the address on this bus for these transmitters? Every device on a Modbus network has a unique server ID. And so you may have, for example, set up the consolidator at 100, and then you just program into each one of those transmitters what they are. And usually, you'll start at 0 and you go from there. So we're going to assume the transmitter 1 is actually at, well, I guess in this case we put it at server ID 247. And we're reading the register address 0. Very often the variables in a read-only state are available out of these transmitters essentially as addresses 0, and it's usually 2 registers, so you like 0 and 1, and then you'd have 2 and 3, etc. So we're going to start at 0, reading out one of my variables. Then you've got a function code, which combines with the address to give you a register number, so we just confirm the register number there for you. And when you give it the type of data you're reading out, in this case it's a floating point, you give it the byte order for those registers, and how many decimal places it's reading in that floating point. If you want, so that Consolidator Plus can do automatic unit conversions, and you can convert it to whatever you want it to be for the display values, you give it the units that it stores in that register with that number. So, okay, we're saying, in this case, gallons per minute. So it looks like we've kind of set it up to read a flow meter here, but in our transmitter example, this might just be gallons, or it could be reading feet. Then you tell it what you want to do in the case of a break condition. So if for some reason the communication fails, we're telling, in this case, default to 0 in that case. If you need them, and you often don't, you do have access to the poll time and the timeouts, but regularly you can just leave those things alone. And then we have an input action you can do, which is a little bit more advanced. If every time it reads this you want it to do something, like you want it to add that to an existing total and then you want to zero it out, or you want to have it send out a digital input signal and say, hey, I successfully read. You can do things like that. Again, most of the things down here you will not even need to worry about for your applications. Now the real beauty of this is that the server ID and the address are something that you program right into your transmitter. They're just numbers you pick. Well, actually, I should say the server ID is just a number you pick. The register address, the function code, the type, the byte order, the units, and the decimals, all of this is just a lookup. You don't have any choices to make. You just look it up in the transmitter manual. It's going to tell you, this is the address where I have the top level, and this is the address where I keep the interface level, and this is the address where I keep the average temperature. Or for flow meter, this is where you get the total. This is where you get the flow rate. They're just going to be a lookup out of the manual. And when you find it in the manual, it will tell you the data type, it will tell you the byte order, it will tell you the units, it will tell you how many decimal places you have. So there's not a lot of choices to make here. The vast majority of this is all just looking it up in your transmitter and chugging those numbers into the screen. And because we've got a full color display here on this LCD, we don't have to deal with any segment fonts or complex programming. It spells out exactly what you want. So you want to know what types are available so you know what you're looking for? Well, this is a drop down, and you'll just pick, you'll read the list, you'll find which one out of the list your transmitter uses, and you're done. So it's very easy to set up. The next Modbus Enhanced Features Package capability is the snooper mode, which is essentially a packet sniffer mode. And what do I mean by that? Well, we have the exact same system here that we did in the last couple of slides. We have our consolidator acting as a client. It's reading out the data from all of these multivariable transmitters. Well, let's say later on I want to go add a display out in the field. I've got this one installed in a panel in my control room, but boy, it'd be really nice to have a consolidator out in the field next to these tanks so that the operators who are out here can actually see what these tank levels are, which apparently are short tanks because I didn't draw my guy very tall. They're very short. But we want to have something out in the field so that they can just install that consolidator here next door. Well, rather than reconfiguring the consolidator that's acting as the master in the control room, rather than doing any kind of reconfiguration of these transmitters, rather than having to have some kind of two-master situation, which is really a no-no in Modbus, I'm going to take a Consolidator Plus, I'm going to put it in a NEMA 4X box, I'm going to install it next to these tanks, I'm going to connect it up to the RS-485 bus, just like every other device is here, and then I'm going to set it up for snooper mode, which means it's going to sit quietly on this bus and look for only the information I tell it to look for, and it's never going to talk. So nothing here will ever know that I snuck this Consolidator Plus on that bus, that I added to it. I don't have to change any of the programming anywhere else in this network. So instead, it sits there and it listens, and you program it up to say, you know what, when you hear the device at server address 247, respond back with its Modbus register 0, you're going to capture that value and display it as one of your process variables. And so you'd program it up in this case with the 12 variables coming out of these transmitters, very much like you did with the client, except instead of actually requesting that information, it just waits for it to come by. So the client's going to request that information of the transmitter. The transmitter is then going to reply back with its information, but that information is also going to get captured by the snooper mode Consolidator Plus. This feature is stellar for people who already have Modbus systems or want to have a new Modbus system set up where, let's say, they have a PLC in the control room talking to their field devices. But then you say, hey, wouldn't it be great to have a display out in the field? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely, except for me to have that display out in the field, I got to figure out what to do with this Modbus system, right? I've got my PLC in my control room. Everything's working great. I really don't want to mess with that. I don't want to bring in my PLC programmer, that's for sure. Well, great. You put a Consolidator Plus on that 45 line in snooper mode, and you just have it capture all the data they're interested in displaying that's already going back to the control room to that PLC. So what do you do to program up a snooper mode consolidator? Well, it's very much the same thing as we did before. I've got my Modbus input, in this case Modbus input 3. That's what I chose to name it. I set it up for snooper mode instead of client mode. And you'll notice all these things are the same. I'm still just telling it, hey, I want you to listen for this specific device's specific address reply. And then you get the function code, the byte order, et cetera, that is all just taken from the manual of the transmitter. So there's not a lot of choices to make there. It's just a lookup table. Very easy to set that up. And now you've added a display onto an existing Modbus network, and you haven't had to reprogram anything that was currently there. All right, so let's talk about our third option, which is the spoofer mode. And this is a new one for Precision Digital, so this might be the first time you've seen this. Let's walk through what we're actually saying here. Assign multiple Modbus addresses. And by that what I mean is the individual IDs assigned to the products. Sometimes people call those the Modbus address, but you can assign it multiple Modbus addresses so that it will respond not only when it's talking to the sort of standard address you program into the Consolidator Plus, which is configurable, right? So you could, for example, set up your Consolidator Plus to be Modbus address 100. And so great, whenever anything talks to device 100, it knows it's talking to the Consolidator Plus. But you could also tell the Consolidator Plus, I want you to respond if someone talks to device 101, or device 102, or device 103, or device 12. Any addresses you want to tell it to respond to. And then you can have it respond with customized register numbers. So in my example I just gave, my default address, so to speak, my standard address that I programmed into my consolidator was 100. And so if I want to pull out any of my process variables, the states of my relays, figure out how it's programmed, I can pull all that out based on the lookup table in the Consolidator Plus manual. And it will tell me, great, if I call Modbus address 100, and if I ask for register 0, I'm getting PV1. But then I can tell it, hey, I also want you to respond to address 101. And when someone requests register 0, this is the customized register numbers, I don't want you to respond with PV1. I want you to respond with this total. And so you can tell it what to respond with at specific registers at other addresses that you program in there. And so what's the advantage of that? Well, let's take a look at it in a use case here. So here we have a Consolidator Plus that's acting as a client. And it is set, or I should say it has the client feature. It's actually, in this case, not really being a client. It's really a slave or a server mode Consolidator Plus, but it's using this feature package to be a spoofer. Forgive my poor writing here. And we have the PLC requesting data from the Consolidator Plus, and we have the Consolidator Plus taking in 4 to 20 milliamp inputs. Well, what is the point of all of that? Why would I set it up like this? So let's pretend for a minute that we didn't yet install this Consolidator Plus. And originally, I had these 4 to 20 milliamp transmitters outputting to, let's say, because we're Precision Digital, let's say these go to panel meters. And so I've got these 4 to 20 milliamp outputs going to 4 panel meters. And previously to the Consolidator Plus, I had my PLC just connecting up via Modbus to all 4 of those panel meters. Well, the PLC is going to have to communicate with this one, which we're going to say is at address 1, and it's going to have to make requests of this one, which is we're going to say via address 2 and 3 and 4, et cetera, et cetera. And when it makes those requests, those panel meters are going to respond back with their level in the tank. Well, if I were to decide I want to replace it with a Consolidator Plus, that gets me this great display, all in one location, full color, all kinds of additional I/O. But I'm stuck with one problem, right? The Consolidator Plus can take in 4 to 20 milliamp signals. That part's easy. That's very easy. You can take in up to 28 4 to 20 milliamp inputs on a Consolidator Plus. The problem then is the PLC's connection. It's still asking for the level from address 1 and address 2 and address 3 and address 4. It still thinks it's talking to those panel meters. So now I got to fly in a guy to talk to to program my PLC or have him remote connect. It's going to cost me a whole bunch of money to have this guy spend hours reprogramming this PLC so that it'll instead pull the data out of the Consolidator Plus. And that's just a huge hassle, right? Generally, whenever you're changing the Modbus pulling programming in a PLC, it is just a pain in the butt. And I hate to say that, but it's just what it is. Well, instead of having the PLC reprogrammed, we're going to use the spoofer mode and the Consolidator Plus, so that whenever the PLC asks the Consolidator for address 1, register 0, the Consolidator Plus is going to respond with the level that corresponds to that transmitter. So when the PLC asks for address 2, register 0, the Consolidator Plus is going to say, hey, I respond to address 2. And when you ask for me for register 0, I respond with the appropriate level from that transmitter. So it's a way to let the Consolidator replace existing Modbus devices invisibly to the PLC. The PLC doesn't know it's not talking to those panel meters. It still thinks it's sending out requests for the same addresses, for the same register numbers, and it's getting back information that makes sense to it. So now I've got one Consolidator Plus replacing all those other devices, and the PLC is none the wiser. That's especially useful where you didn't even have panel meters. Let's just say I had 4 Modbus devices that were all connected up to my PLC, but then I wanted to add a remote display in the field. Well, then great. I could do this. I could take the 4 to 20s from those transmitters, and I could use the 485 connection to go to the PLC. Done. So the big takeaway for spoofer mode is it's useful when you want to replace old Modbus equipment and you don't want to have to reprogram the Modbus software you've got pulling out that data. How do you program that? Well, once again, pretty easy. In this case, it's a Modbus output I'd be programming, so I just called it Modbus Output 1. You program it for spoofer mode. You tell it what the input is for this output. In other words, what is the thing inside the Consolidator that I'm going to respond with when this gets pulled? And so in this case, I want total 1, because we're using flow meter examples here. I want total 1 to be what I'm going to respond with. Whenever something looks for server ID 9 and it asks for address 0. Now generally on the Consolidator, it's going to not be address 9. The Consolidator I'm programming this on might be address 100 or 1 or something other than 9. But whenever I get a request for server ID 9, I'm going to respond with address 0. I'm going to respond if requested for address 0, and I'm going to respond with the total that I programmed here. And then again, I just have the specific setups that would be, in this case, a lookup to what the PLC is expecting to get. And that's your spoofer mode. So how do you get the new Modbus Enhanced Features package? It's not something that comes standard on the Consolidator Plus. Server or slave mode, that comes standard. But you want to be a client, a snooper, or a spoofer, you've got to get this package. How do you do that? Well, you order it. And you order a PDK9000-M1 key for $500 at predig.com. That key gets enabled with the factory with your consolidator. So you would order your Consolidator Plus, you'd include that key on the order, and we send it to you with those features enabled. Or if you've got a consolidator you purchased after February 15th, you can purchase just the key. You give us a unique identifier number that's in your consolidator programming. We can help you get that, and then we give you a program code that you punch in that lets you unlock these features. Hopefully that's clear to everybody. Let me know if it's not. Now, I showed you what the screens look like on the consolidator if you're trying to program it by hand, but realistically, you want to use the software. You know, we've got free Consolidator Plus configuration software for a reason, and it does just make things a lot easier. You connect up, you do power the consolidator, so you've got your power coming in somewhere over here. But then you connect up the consolidator with a simple micro USB connection that just goes into the back of the consolidator. It goes right in your computer from there. Lets you configure all your bar graphs, your displays, set your colors, everything you're going to want to do, and it makes it very easy to do it. And of course, it groups it all conveniently on one screen. So like if you're looking at Tank 1, you have all of Tank 1's channel information right there, easy to display, but then right next to it is Tank 2, Tank 3, Tank 4, etc. Because you can fit more on a laptop screen than you can this display. Huge advantage of using the software is you can save your controller settings. So if they get messed up by somebody in the field, or you want to drop in another one into a same type application, or even just use it as a starting point for another application later, you can do that. It's all organized very clearly, very intuitively. Tells you on the left if you're looking at your channels, which are your actual PVs that you define. Then you've got your totals, your inputs, your outputs. Define what you want to display on your various screens. Very useful for alarms that you want to use different colors on, because you can just click on these boxes and select from the color wheel what you want. And it's great for these Modbus settings, because now you've got easy to access drop-down menus, everything spelled out that you're trying to program. So it just helps avoid confusion. I highly recommend that people use the software. It works out really well when you do. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the Consolidator Plus, we have a PDD 9000 Consolidator Plus demo unit. What is the demo unit? Well, it's a standalone Consolidator Plus. We mount these feet on it so it stands upright on your desk. We attach a light and horn so that the relays can give you some feedback to it. We offer these light and horns, of course. And we also connect one of our PD 9502 signal generators, which is a 4 to 20 milliamp signal that goes into it that essentially acts as a transmitter. It gets its power from the 24-volt output that is present on every consolidator input. Every 4 to 20 milliamp input on a Consolidator Plus has its own isolated 24-volt power supply. So we're using that to power up this 9502 and bring back that 4 to 20 signal that it generates. And we'll see it in a minute. You know, there's a lot of different ways that this is set up, so you can use it to see what it's capable of, or you can use it as a basis for your own programming. So with the demo, you get your Consolidator Plus. It's got one of every input card, so you can play with it and have 4 to 20 milliamp inputs, pulse inputs, relay outputs, 4 to 20 milliamp outputs. It's got the enhanced Modbus feature package on it. You get your 9502 signal generator. You get the light and horn. We give you all the cables you might need to connect up to this thing. And we put it all inside of a nice box for shipping and bringing around. So this is especially great for you distributors in the audience. If you have a desire to want to get one of these to show it to your customers, we can certainly work a deal on that. Or if you want to just review it with us, we'll send you out one of these cases. You can go through it with us on a video call and send it back. So I won't go too much more into the demo unit, but you let me know if you'd like to see one of these Consolidator Plus demo units or talk about getting your own. Just go ahead and click yes here so we'll know to reach out. All right, now let me talk about a couple of questions that we have before we jump on into looking at my live unit here. So let's see. Tony has asked a question. Actually, it looks like he might have asked two, but his first question was, as this is now a master device, can we program buttons on the screen to write registers to the connected slave? For example, could we calibrate the sensor via a write register? And the answer to that was no. Unfortunately, you cannot do that, Tony. Though we are a master, we solely pull data out of those slaves. We really don't write calibration data back to them. Now, if that's something you wanted to do, keep in mind you can always do your calibration right in the Consolidator Plus. You could recalibrate it so that if you have issues with your calibration, rather than recalibrating your sensor, you could just rescale the consolidator and take away any of that error. But no, you can't set it up so that I just push a button on a consolidator and it sort of sends out some kind of number I program to write data into the slave devices. That's just a little too complicated for what it does right now. And so if I just jump down here to Tony's second question to address that too while we're here, can we read more than a quantity of 2 on one input? Meaning if my start address or register is 0, can I read, say, quantities of 5 or even 10? So you can certainly read more variables. However, you're taking individual variables for every Modbus input. So if you wanted to read 10 different Modbus variables, then you would program each one of those independently to have 10 Modbus inputs, and you could tell it to read 4001 and 4002 as a float as one Modbus input, and the second Modbus input would be 4003, 40,003, 40,005 as the second Modbus input, etc. You wouldn't rack them up in like a coil read or anything like that and say, hey, go get those 10 values and display those 10 values here. You just program them up as 10 individual Modbus inputs. And to a person who is an expert in Modbus, that might sound a little bit more kludgy than it has to be. But I find that, given most people here just know enough about Modbus to kind of get the job done, handling it one process variable at a time, reading the registers that are appropriate for it, that seems to be the best user-friendly way for us to have done that. So I think it just makes it a little bit easier for those of you in the audience who sort of know Modbus. Well, this is set up for you. This is a product for you. And unfortunately, that does limit a little bit what it can do for the Modbus experts. All right, and I see, Tony, it sounds like you certainly understand my answer, so I appreciate that. Working my way up here, Greg has asked about the 24-volt power supply I mentioned. All right, well, that's not purely Modbus related, but I'm certainly happy to cover that. So his question is, I hear you write that every 4 to 20 milliamp input has a power supply. That is correct, so let me just make sure that it's clear what I mean by that. So every 4 to 20 milliamp input on the consolidator has its own isolated 4 to 20 milliamp power supply. So if I go back some to my earlier slides here, I guess I don't call it the number of inputs, but the consolidator can have a number of 4 to 20 milliamp inputs. It can have 28 4 to 20 milliamp inputs. Every individual 4 to 20 milliamp input. So on the back of the consolidator, there are I/O cards. That I/O card has 4 analog inputs on it. That will have 4 isolated 24-volt power supplies on it that you can use to power up your transmitter, bring the signal back into the consolidator. You can get a total of 1,600 milliamps out of the Consolidator Plus's power supplies. So if all you're doing is powering 2-wire transmitters, you can power a whole lot of 2-wire transmitters with 1,600 milliamps. But you can get up to 200 milliamps out of each one of those supplies. And so if you're running a 3 or 4-wire transmitter, and let's say your 3-wire transmitter also needs 200 milliamps to power, well, then you're going to be limited to 8 of those inputs before you get capped at that 1,600 milliamps of output from those 24-volt power supplies. But I hope that's clear. It does come with an isolated 24-volt power supply for actually not only every analog input, which I did happen to mention, but also for every analog output. And so we give you no shortage of isolated power supplies to keep your wiring clean and all your crosstalk down. Let's see here. And then I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll take a look at the live demo unit I've got here. And so I've got a question from Owen. And Owen has a question about the setup screen. So let me bring up that slide for you. Okay, yeah, so Owen wants to confirm that the only things he really has to program here is the server ID, the register address, function code, type, byte order, and decimals, maybe units. Everything else here I could probably leave alone. And it sounds like most of these items are things that will already be present on my network or in the device. So is there anything I have to actually program here, or is this all just lookups? And so I believe that you do have it right, Owen. Your server ID here, now this is the example where we were the master. So this is the consolidator reading out of Modbus devices. So we're the client, and each individual Modbus input has you program in the server ID. So that's the ID of the device that we're reading out of, and the register address of the data we want to pull out. The function code is going to be given by the device. That gets you your register number, which confirms. And that just gives you one more thing you can look up in the transmitter or the flow meter manual to confirm that number is correct. And then, yes, the type is fixed by the device you're reading out of. The byte order is fixed by the device you're reading out of. Its units are going to be fixed on the device you're reading out of. And in this case, because we're a float, we need to give it a decimal count, and that's going to be fixed by the device you read out of. So really, the address you want, the function code, the type, the byte order, the units, the decimals are all fixed things. Those are all lookups. And then all you have to do is just check the server ID on the transmitter, flow meter, etc. Those can be programmed. Everything on the bus has to have a unique address or a unique server ID. And so that will vary application to application, transmitter to transmitter. But it's something that you just program in there, and so you just want to make sure you check that one. And that's something you can look up, but you got to look it up in the programming of the transmitter. It's not going to be just spelled out for you in the manual, like, hey, this is ID 1, because you could have 10 of these on your Modbus 45 line, and so every one of those has to have something unique. So that's not a manual lookup, which I think you seem to get. I'm just stating that is something you'll have to check on your transmitter. But the idea here is there's really not a lot of choices to make. As long as you've got the manual, you're good to go. You just look up in your transmitter manual what all of these things are that are underlined, and you're done. You don't really need too much worry about, although I would recommend you come up with a break condition you're happy with. Either go in a high condition, go in an alarm condition, go to 0. Do something so that you know what would happen if there's a break. That is probably one that you'd have to give a little thought to. But the rest of this you probably don't have to bother with at all. And so there's not a lot of choices to make. It's just a lot of lookup tables. And so that's why I think this is such a great product for people who are not Modbus masters. All right, so with that, you'll give me a lot of time. I do want to briefly show my Consolidator Plus demo unit here. And so let me get to that. And I'm going to do that by, oh, well, actually, I seem to be having a problem sharing my webcam here for some reason, so perhaps I won't be showing that to you. Bear with me 1 minute here. Thanks for bearing with me with a little bit of a technical difficulty. I know how to resolve this one. It's just going to take me a quick second. Okay, there we go. So let's try this again here. Again, apologize for this delay. Okay, there we go. I got it fixed. And now I'm going to share that and pop that up here. Okay, and now everybody should be seeing my Consolidator Plus. I'm a little off center, so let me get that corrected. Isn't that the way live demos always go? All right, so there's my Consolidator Plus screen. If you're seeing something other than my Consolidator Plus screen, do me a favor and send me a chat to let me know. You will notice a little bit of waviness on the display. I apologize for that. That's just the nature of webcams showing LCDs that refresh like this. I assure you that that waviness is not a result of the actual Consolidator Plus. It's just a fluke of the way we're showing it here. And so this looks very similar to the one we saw the pictures of in the slideshow. Here I've got my screen title, my 4 tanks. Actually, we're looking at one that has a lot more color to it. There we go, in the webinar earlier. To be clear, by the way, when I'm pushing these buttons, these are soft keys. So it's not a touchscreen display. Nothing happens if I just touch those. But as these are soft keys, and you can program them for each screen to be whatever you want, to acknowledge relays, turn it on and off my auto scan, cycle between various screens, reset relay information. There's all kinds of things you can do with that. Because of that, that's why they show up down here. So I'm actually pushing the rubberized mechanical buttons below them, but you see the soft screen key respond when I push it down. And so these are just different screens you can program the Consolidator show. It's very easy to program. In fact, while I'm here, I might as well show you. In this case, you see we've got the 4 tanks that we saw a moment ago, same color schemes. We just get rid of the bar graphs. And one of the great things about the Consolidator Plus is how easy it is to program. And so in this case, if, for example, I wanted to, let's just say we're going to get rid of tank 4, and instead of the numbers, we just want to see bar graphs. All I want is bar graphs to make it really simple for my operators. Well, if this were a PLC or an HMI system, I'd have to resize this, choose new text locations, choose new fonts, all that, figure out how I'm going to display the bar graph. Consolidator Plus, I just go into my menu, go to my setup, go to my setup. Then I'm going to go down until I get to my screens. And right into the screens, you see I've got this screen 3, where I have tank 1 water, tank 2 water, tank 3 oil, tank 4 oil displayed. I'm going to go ahead and remove tank 4 oil, done. And then I'm going to go down to these options over here on the right that say things like show title, so channel number, show bar graphs. So let's show the channel number. We'll turn that checkbox on. We're going to turn on show bar graphs. We're in fact going to turn on bar graphs only because I only want to see numbers. And we'll save that. And now when I go back out of my programming menu, that same screen we were on before now is showing me channels 30, 31, 32. And all it's doing is giving me bar graphs because that's what I told it I wanted. So very, very easy to program up what you want to see on this product. And we've got plenty of other screens, and we can go through these if you'd like. If you want to be contacted to review the demo, I'd be happy to go through each one of these. But these are some tank detail screens showing the Consolidator Plus as a duplex pump controller. Sorry, I turned on our light and horn there for a moment. We can get things like cycle time, run times and cycle counts for your pumps, actual annunciator inputs for your pump status, feet and inches display for the sump. Same basic setup for lift station controller, except you've got some additional analog inputs coming in here to show you pressure, pH, and methane percentage. Just a large rate and total display, a smaller rate and total display showing lots more rates and totals on one screen. Nice gas detection example. This is an example of it just being an annunciator, showing how it can turn on these annunciator panels and really be programmed to say anything you want it to say given the state of those inputs. Our 5-zone bar graph indicator, so if you happen to have a lot of those vertical LED bar graph meters around and you'd like to get something better put in their place that's perhaps more capable, has more outputs, we can certainly swap in and do the job that those 5-zone bar graph displays handle. But this is the screen I wanted to show you. This is a separator tank that is reading all of the information out via Modbus. And so here's our top level of the level transmitter, our interface level. You'll notice I'm showing top level in feet and inches, my interface level just in feet. You just pick it. You pick what unit you want to display it in. Some people find it very useful to have the feet and inches because that's the way the tanks are specified and what people are familiar with. We've got our average temp. Pick the color for each one. And then we're also bringing in some information from a flow meter. We're bringing in our gallons per minute, which at the moment is 0. And we've got our inflow total in this case in gallons. And all of these things are coming in via Modbus. So I'd be connected up to one Modbus multivariable level transmitter for these 3 variables and one flow meter for those 2 variables. And I could show you the screens we use to, for example, set up that top level. So I'm going to go into my setup, and I'm going to go to my inputs, and I'm going to go to my Modbus inputs, because that's what I'm doing on that channel. I'm bringing a Modbus input. So here's my 5 Modbus inputs. I named that one MV1, so Modbus variable 1, top level. I can make that name whatever I want. That's just what I happen to choose. Set it up for client mode. The server ID of that level transmitter is 10, and the address that I need to read out of is also 10 to pull out that top level information. So it's confirming for me that function code 04, the register I'm reading in that transmitter, is 30,011 to 30,012, because that transmitter uses a float. Its byte order is ABCD. It reads out in terms of feet, and it's got 1 decimal place built into that float. And that's it. I'm done. In this case, because it's a demo and I don't actually have it connected to a level transmitter, when the Modbus signal breaks, I've got it set up to go to a default of 14.8 feet, which is why I have a display right now. But that's just a little bit of how the sausage is made here on the demo unit. So now that I've got this programmed, I have a Modbus input that I can now manipulate just like it was a 4 to 20. That's the beauty of this system, is now that I've programmed up those simple variables that I can choose from, which are all really lookups, I can now treat it just like any other 4 to 20 milliamp signal. So when I go to program up that channel, there's my top level, that's a channel. Well, I'm just scaling it by 2-point linear. I leave all the scaling alone because it's a Modbus variable. It's just a linear 1-to-1. I set my units for it up, set what I want my bar graph top and bottom to be if I'm using the bar graph, and I'm done. And I then go to screens, and I create a screen called separator tank parentheses Modbus, and I just add in that top level to be something I want to see there. And those are the 5 variables that I chose to display on this screen. If I now want to have relay outputs for alarms or 4 to 20 milliamps retransmitting back to my control room, I'm basing it totally on these numbers now. I'm out of the world of Modbus. None of that matters to me anymore. I just programmed that one screen to get my Modbus input set up, bring in that one variable, and now I'd set up a second screen. I'd set up a second Modbus input to bring in my second variable, a third, a fourth, and a fifth Modbus variables. And then they're in. They're Modbus inputs. They're done. At that point, I'm just building channels to give them all names and units, and then putting those channels on screens. And if I want to set alarms and such, I go build an alarm, and I point it to that channel. Done. So I hope that's been a great introduction to the capabilities of the Consolidator Plus's new enhanced features package. There is a lot that you can do with it. Luckily, it is also very easy to program up all the things you can do with it. So if you're a Modbus expert, great. You should have plenty of opportunities to use the Consolidator Plus because you're probably out there using Modbus transmitters, flow meters, etc. on a regular basis. If you are not a Modbus expert, great. It gives you an opportunity to access all those gee whiz Modbus features and all those variables, but you don't have to do any actual programming. You know, you're not programming it in C. You're not putting any ladder logic together. You're not programming a PLC. You're picking some drop downs that are lookups and manuals, and you're programming it all with the Consolidator Plus free programming software. So I hope this has been a little enlightening. I hope you see some opportunities for this. If you've got other questions or you'd like to reach out, feel free. My contact information is here. Drop me an email. I'd be happy to respond. If you get the survey at the end, feel free to let us know that you'd like us to reach out about some specific application or question you may have. Those of you who submitted questions that did not get answered, we'll be sure to reach out to you and discuss those with you. There's a couple in here that are just a little too complicated for us to get into here today about the specifics of applications and things, but we will get back to you there. And I thank you very much for your time. I hope it has been worth it. I hope to see you at another future Precision Digital presentation. You all have a good weekend. Bye.